Welcome back. With this lecture, actually a couple of brief lectures, I want to look at the theology of the so-called Thomas Christians, or the Thomas Christians in the southwestern part of India. Before we do that, I want to spend some time looking at the possibility that indeed Thomas actually did arrive in India and was the one who basically planted the churches that became the churches of the Thomas Christians that we know today, that exist there today. So in order to do that, let me back up, excuse me, and begin looking at, again, the Thomas Christians, and then that will be followed by a discussion of the Thomas Christians' theology. So let's start with the claim. According to the Acts of Thomas, written about 200, the roots of the church in India were laid during the apostolic age, when the Apostle Thomas traveled first to northern India and then to the Malabar coast in the south, where he was martyred about 72 AD. So that's the overall claim. We already kind of introduced that earlier. Is this possible? It's certainly possible that Thomas could have reached the Indian subcontinent during the first century. A number of authors that you see listed there certainly argue the case, or at least give us good evidence of the case, particularly that book that you see there, that St. Thomas in India. The book is a collection of articles basically from scholars, Asian and Indian scholars, looking into the possibility of that this account is actually true. Thomas has always been honored as the Apostle of India. He probably made, again, 2 journeys to India. The first journey in 40 to 50 AD was to the northwestern parts of ancient India and also included present-day Afghanistan and Pakistan. In his second mission to India, from 52 to 72 AD, he established Christian communities in South India and is said to have made a journey to China from South India. The historicity of these journeys has been sufficiently discussed by historians and is now held to be an established historical fact. Still, it is true that there are some skeptics who consider the Thomas element in India church history as a pious fraud. They accept that the traditional stories and pious legends exist in abundance, both in India and outside India, of the mission of Thomas to India, yet apparently they remain skeptical. This author, James, and I won't attempt to try and pronounce his name, you can see it there on the slide, is a man that has devoted himself to the study of Thomas in India. And he asked this question: are there substantiated historical records? Do there exist archaeological, epigraphic, and even numismatic? Numismatics has to do with the study of coins. These records to prove that the mission of Thomas in India? These are the questions they often ask. To satisfy their curiosity, we are making an attempt, this author is saying, to bring together all the historical proofs from archaeology, numismatics, epigraphy, and for the establishment of Christian communities in India by St. Thomas the Apostle. So let's look at the evidence. First of all, the Church Fathers. According to 4th century ecclesiastical history of Bishop Eusebius of Caesarea, we've seen him before in a much earlier lecture, he evangelized Parthia, and we talked about just recently the empire of the Parthians over in modern-day Syria, Iran, Persia. The apocryphal Acts of Thomas, originally composed in Syriacs, according to those, he allegedly visited the court of the Indo-Parthian king. So again, Thomas was in Parthia, according to Eusebius. According to the Acts of Thomas, he was there in the court of the Indo-Parthian king. And later Christian tradition says Thomas extended his apostolate into India, where he was recognized as the founder of the Church of the Syrian Malabar Christians, or Christians of St. Thomas. Eusebius writes of a visit to India by Pantaenus from Alexandria, another traveler around 180 to 190 AD, in which he encountered Christians on the Malabar coast. So notice the dates, that's fairly early, 2nd century. And so early tradition makes note that these established Christians were respected and orthodox. The church in India was even visited by Pantaenus and perhaps other representatives of Alexandria in 190 AD. Another bishop named David of Basra, a bishop from Persia, was reported to have visited India around 300 AD, and another bishop was reported to have come all the way from India and attended the Council of Nicaea in 325. So we have the records of the 1st century visit by Thomas. We have 2nd century records of those that saw or met Thomas Christians, so-called, or Christianity, in Southwest Asia, Southwest India, I should say. And also, again, by the 3rd century, we're still getting reports of this. So the evidence of the historicity of Thomas's visit is piling up. Other records. Theophilus, a native of either Socotra or the Maldives, an emissary of the Roman Emperor Constantius to Arabia and India, claimed that he encountered Christians in India again in AD 354. Indeed, in addition to the Acts of Thomas, a number of early Syriac writings, as well as some of the early church fathers and even the Didache that we saw way back, seem to corroborate his claim. Furthermore, coins, this is the numismatic part, that's numismatics again, is the study of coins that we find, dating from the 1st century, have been found in northwest India bearing the name of King Gundafar, and Gundafar was an Indian ruler that was allegedly converted by Thomas, according to the Thomas records. So there we have the Acts of Thomas talking about this King Gundafar, and we have coins that indicated he wasn't a genuinely historical individual. So making the claim of the Acts of Thomas that much more credible. And of course, there are the Thomas Christians themselves. The church that Thomas supposedly founded is still known as the Mar Thoma Church. The Mar in Syriac means my Lord, so it's often a term that means reverend or saint or something like that. So Mar Thoma means Lord Thomas or Reverend Thomas or even Saint Thomas. And they continue to use the Syriac liturgy to this day. The so-called St. Thomas Christians have by and large remained a relatively small minority in the sea of Hinduism in southern India. However, for the most part of their history, they have been treated as a separate caste by the Indian rulers and thus hindering their efforts to evangelize those around them. But for our purposes, the very fact, again, of these Thomas Christians, who are very much there today and go by that name, certainly an indication that something to this account of Thomas's visit to India certainly has a degree of credibility. Again, some say that Thomas arrived by boat in 52 AD and was well respected by the people. And there's an account in the Acts of Thomas that appears to attach Thomas to the Punjab people. Many songs, poems, inscriptions speak of Thomas in the native Malayalam language, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. By ancient belief and canonical doctrines, Thomas Christians trace their origins to the arrival of Thomas on Malankara, on a lagoon near the present day. I'll let you do that name. Kondung Alur in 52, basically AD. CE is Common Era, which is just a modern way of saying AD. And he established, here's the point of this slide, he established congregations in 7 villages. And this tradition is very prominent. And there's very many details about him establishing these different villages. And again, this is we're just looking for a certain level of credibility to this. Interestingly, how could the Indian people be so acquainted with Thomas and Christianity if someone had not brought the gospel to them? at an early date. Evidence of Thomas and his name related to Christ is proof in itself. The correlation is far too odd to be a fake or misinterpretation, says this particular author. So, summarizing the matter and question of all these traditions. Early tradition makes note that these established Christians were respected and orthodox. But the tradition also indicates that they are a Nestorian, as we've already seen, that they were or had become part of the Church of the East, which meant that as the Church of the East spread, and we mentioned in an earlier lecture, it finally arrived over on the Indian subcontinent and found that there were already Christians there. Now, they were probably, again, already influenced by the Church of the East and its Syrian origins, Syrian Nestorian doctrine, and which means that they probably didn't have to, bring them into alignment with what they already were, which was basically part of the Church of the East that had maybe sort of gotten there ahead of time. They were Syrian in ecclesiology and as well as practice and liturgy. So the question is, how did Syrians end up in India? They were Syrian in ecclesiology. The historical relationship between the St. Thomas Christians and the East Syrian or church in Persia from the earliest times is based on two historical events. The first was the arrival in that same city, Kondun Alur, probably not pronounced correctly, of a group of East Syrian Christians led by a certain Nai Toman or Thomas Kenai, not the source of the name for Thomas Christians, but Thomas Kenai Yani or Ai, around the 4th century. The second event was the arrival of another group of Christians from Persia, along with their two church leaders, Mar Sapor and Mar Prot, around the 9th century. So the Syrians kept sending delegates over in that direction, obviously. Various stories and traditions exist around these two events, but a few points are undisputed. First, Persian Christians brought new vigor, leadership, and a new liturgical tradition, that is, East Syrian, sometimes called Chaldean tradition, to the fledgling, or actually not so fledgling, but the established St. Thomas Christian community. Second, the St. Thomas Christians warmly welcomed these Persian Christians, and according to the received tradition, the kings of Kerala bestowed land and royal honors upon them. Third, until the arrival of the Portuguese missionaries, the Persian church exercised jurisdiction and oversight over these Thomas Christians. There's no evidence of any resistance or resentment against the Persian ecclesiastical rule on the part of these St. Thomas Christians, again, probably because they already had ties before these historical events actually happened, the ones that are recorded, so they must have had ties back to that group already. This group spoke Syriac and blended Hindu faith elements with Syrian rituals, which again means that they had been established there for a while. The Thomas Christians had a strong Jewish influence to their worship, which would make sense if they'd been established from as early as the 1st century, and this would consequently affect their theology and standing in the Orthodox Church. It would appear then that their brand of Christianity was very syncretistic, holding services on Sunday, which again the Jewish Sabbath, and carrying out rituals that derive from Jewish sacrifice. So again, must have had a very strong Jewish element to them, which again makes sense if they'd have been established as far back as the 1st century. So they became Hindu in culture, Christian in religion, and Judeo-Syrian Oriental in worship. Even among these Thomas Christians, the caste system remained strong and caused a social elite in some circumstances between the Christians and other Hindus. And Thomas Christians seem to have, again, one foot in the Jewish realm and one foot in Hindu culture. Then, with the spread of Islam, the Indian church was quickly becoming isolated to the growth of Western ideals. So basically, when Islam came through and first conquered northern Africa, then as moving east, Syria, Persia, those kind of places, would have cut the Thomas Christians off from this connection that they had to the Church of the East. Islamic progress was further sealing of Eastern theology in the Thomas Christians, so it would have been fair to point out that Christianity formed in India was only reminiscent of the Christianity that had continued to develop in the West. Which is to say, the point there is that the theological developments that continued to affect the Western Church that we've been talking about for the last several weeks in our lectures and discussions would have been separated from the Thomas Christians, so we shouldn't be surprised that they were not a part of that discussion. In later years, the Portuguese began to interact with a small group of Christians in Asia, as we've seen, and they were surprised to see that these Christians had no history of the Western Church, and we just explained why they didn't. They'd been cut off by Islam. The Roman Catholic Church was not their authority. Who is the Pope? We never heard of him. That was their reaction. And so the Thomas Christians claimed to follow the episcopal jurisdiction for about 13 years from Antioch in Syria, even though, again, that had been pretty much eliminated by Islam. They were still perpetuating that. So one must understand that by the 14th and 15th century, Thomas Christians have been separated from Western Christianity and connected to an entirely different set of doctrines, as we've just been saying. So that brings us to the theology of the Thomas Christians. So we're going to stop this particular video, and we will pick it up in the final video of this series next.